Picture this. It's 3 a.m. on a moonless night in the North Atlantic, May 1943. A German U-boat commander stands on his conning tower, confident in the darkness that's protected submarine hunters for centuries. His batteries are charging, his diesels rumbling smoothly, and his radar detector is silent. He has no idea that 20 miles away, a British corvette is watching him on a glowing green screen, tracking his every movement with perfect precision through technology his scientists swore was impossible. In 8 minutes, he and his entire crew of 48 men will be dead, killed by an invisible enemy they never knew existed. This is the true story of how a device, smaller than a car engine, destroyed the most feared submarine force in history, sank 42 U-boats in a single month, and changed warfare forever. What you're about to discover will shock you, because this isn't just another World War II story. This is about the moment when science became more powerful than courage, when invisible electromagnetic waves proved deadlier than torpedoes, and when a secret so closely guarded that even today most people have never heard the full truth about how close Germany came to winning the war, and how one British invention stopped them cold. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why Winston Churchill called this technology more valuable than entire armies, and why the Germans never saw it coming until it was far too late. North Atlantic, May 24, 1943, 0600 hours. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz sat alone in his headquarters at the Hotel Am Steinplatz in Berlin, staring at the message sheet in front of him with hands that trembled slightly despite his iron self-control. The order he was about to transmit to every U-boat commander still alive in the Atlantic would mark the end of everything they had fought for since 1939. The admission that his wolf packs had been defeated not by superior seamanship or brilliant tactics, but by a technology his technical experts had repeatedly assured him was physically impossible. A radar system that could see in absolute darkness what human eyes could never detect, even in broad daylight. The numbers on his desk told a story written in blood and seawater. 42 U-boats destroyed in a single month. 1,832 of his best submariners dead, gone to the bottom of the Atlantic in steel coffins they believed were invincible. 25% of his entire operational strength annihilated in 30 days, all because British escort corvettes and patrol aircraft carried devices that could detect a submarine periscope at 900 yards in pitch darkness, could track a surfaced U-boat charging its batteries from 3 miles away, could guide depth charges and hedgehog mortars onto targets the attacking crews never even saw with their own eyes. His boats sat on the surface at night, completely unaware they were being watched, tracked, and hunted by an electromagnetic net they couldn't detect or escape. The message went out at 0615 hours, transmitted to every U-boat station from Norway to the Bay of Biscay. Withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes immediately. Cease offensive operations against convoys. Return to base. And in that moment, as Donitz would later write in his memoirs with the bitter honesty of a defeated commander, we had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The submarine war that had brought Britain to the edge of starvation in 1940 and 1941, that had sunk millions of tons of Allied shipping, that had been Germany's only strategic weapon capable of winning the war, was over, finished not by more ships or braver sailors, but by physics and engineering that his naval intelligence services had never anticipated. But what Donitz didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know sitting in his Berlin office that morning, was that the technology defeating him had first been tested on a small Flower-class corvette named HMS Orcis in the Firth of Clyde on March 25, 1941. More than 2 years before this moment of surrender, a prototype device designated Type 271 had tracked a submerged submarine at 4,000 yards and detected its periscope at 900 yards, ranges that seemed like science fiction to naval officers who had spent their careers relying on human eyesight and binoculars. British radar engineers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had achieved these impossible ranges using a cavity magnetron operating at 10-centimeter wavelength, a frequency band that German radar warning receivers couldn't detect because German scientists had convinced themselves such radars couldn't exist, creating a blind spot in Nazi defensive systems that would prove absolutely fatal to the U-boat arm. The British operator, sitting at his Type 271 console aboard HMS Orcis that March morning in 1941, had watched the green trace on his oscilloscope display, carefully adjusting the gain control as the target submarine raised its periscope for a practice attack run during training exercises. And there it was, appearing on his screen like magic, a sharp spike at 900 yards, clear as daylight. Though the Scottish morning outside was thick with mist and fog that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards, the 10-centimeter radar waves were penetrating the sea clutter, and wave returns that would have completely swallowed the echo on older metric wavelength radars, pulling out the tiny signature of a periscope cutting through the waves. And he had called out the bearing to the bridge, his voice steady despite the excitement of watching history being made. Contact bearing 045 degrees, range 900 yards, probable periscope. Not knowing, not possibly able to comprehend, that he was witnessing the first successful demonstration of a technology that would sink 42 U-boats in a single month, just 2 years later. That would kill 30,000 German that would change naval warfare more completely than the introduction of steam power or the dreadnought battleship. What made this moment truly revolutionary? What separated it from every previous radar development wasn't just the detection itself. Naval radar had been tracking surface vessels since the late 1930s. British, German, and American ships all carried various radar systems by 1940, but the ability to see something as small as a submarine periscope cutting through waves, a target less than 18 inches wide, that earlier British radars operating at 1.5 meter wavelength couldn't distinguish from the sea surface itself, from wave tops and whitecaps and floating debris, that was genuinely new. Yet this new E-span system operating at 2,950 MHz could resolve it clearly, could pick out that tiny metal tube from all the clutter of an angry ocean, the narrow beam width of the cheese antenna, so called for its distinctive truncated parabolic shape that looked like a wheel of cheese cut in half, provided angular accuracy of 2 degrees, precise enough to guide a corvette directly onto a submerged U-boat's position for a devastating depth charge attack. No more searching, no more guessing, no more relying on the sonar operator's skill and luck, just pure electronic precision pointing like a finger at the enemy hiding beneath the waves. The cavity that made this technological miracle possible had been invented by John Randall and Harry Boot at the University of Birmingham in February 1940, two brilliant physicists working in a laboratory that would have seemed primitive by modern standards, a device no bigger than a small electric motor, fitting in the palm of a man's hand, that could generate microwave power, levels that every previous physicist had thought fundamentally impossible with existing technology. And within weeks of its first demonstration, Winston Churchill, recognizing genius when he saw it, and understanding immediately what this invention meant for Britain's survival, had personally ordered it shared with the Americans in what would become known as the Tizard mission, named after Sir Henry Tizard, who led the scientific delegation. Churchill recognized that this single invention might determine the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic, might be the difference between British survival and starvation, between Allied victory and Nazi conquest of Europe, though neither Churchill nor the scientists working on the project could have predicted exactly how completely and how quickly it would revolutionize anti-submarine warfare, turning the hunters into the hunted almost overnight. By September 1941, just 6 months after that first successful test, 32 Royal Navy corvettes carried Type 271 radar sets, the distinctive lantern-shaped rado mounted prominently on their bridges, looking to German U-boat commanders like nothing more than an odd navigation lighthousing. Production orders were climbing rapidly toward 350 units as British industry mobilized to manufacture these war-winning devices. Each one was being assembled at the Allen West factory in London with the desperate urgency of a weapon that could literally turn the tide of war, with workers putting in 16-hour shifts, with priority allocation of components and materials. Though the Germans remained completely and tragically unaware of this development, their intelligence services were focused obsessively on breaking Allied convoy codes rather than investigating the strange perspex structures appearing on British escort vessels, missing the forest for the trees, looking for intelligence coups when they should have been analyzing technology. The U-boat commanders, operating in the Atlantic during this period, from late 1941 through early 1943, still believed absolutely that night surface operations gave them complete invisibility, made them masters of the ocean. And why shouldn't they believe this? Their tactical doctrine, refined by Donitz himself during his time commanding U-boats in the First World War, stated categorically that a surfaced submarine at night was virtually undetectable, beyond 500 yards even in the best visibility conditions. This wasn't just theory. It was based on decades of practical experience, on thousands of hours of night operations, on the fundamental limitations of human eyesight in darkness, and their operational patterns reflected this absolute confidence in their invisibility. Surface at dusk, as the light faded, run on diesel engines through the night while charging the massive battery banks that powered underwater operations. Attack convoys on the surface where their 17-knot top speed gave them mobility advantage over 10-knot merchant ships. Then dive at dawn before Allied aircraft could spot them from above. It had worked brilliantly in 1940 and 1941, during what U-boat crews called the happy time, when they were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. Captain Lieutenant Werner Henke, commanding U-515, would later describe in his meticulously kept war diary the typical night surface routine that every U-boat commander followed like a religious ritual. Surfaced at 2,100 hours, sea state 3, moderate waves, visibility approximately 2,000 meters in the darkness, began battery charge cycle while proceeding on course 3 to 0 degrees at 12 knots, making good time toward the convoy routes, diesel engines running smooth, the familiar rumble that every submariner found comforting after hours of electric motor silence. The crew enjoyed fresh air after 14 hours submerged, men smoking on the conning tower, the acrid smell of diesel exhaust mixing with salt spray. No sign of enemy forces anywhere on the horizon. The ocean belonged to us in the darkness, completely unaware, tragically and fatally unaware, that British escorts equipped with Type 271 radar could track his boat at 3 times his visual range, watching his every move on their green glowing displays while his lookouts strained their eyes and saw nothing but empty ocean stretching to the horizon. He was visible to them as clearly as if searchlights were illuminating his boat, but he had no idea, no clue, no warning whatsoever. The battery charging process itself created a vulnerability that U-boat designers had never adequately addressed because they never imagined technology would make night surface operations dangerous. The massive electrical systems required 6 to 8 hours of surface running to fully replenish the lead-acid battery cells that powered all underwater operations. Each Type VIIC U-boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, carried to complete sets of 62 cells, weighing over 200 tons total when fully charged, a staggering amount of weight devoted to electrical storage. These batteries demanded constant maintenance, needed regular topping up with distilled water, generated explosive hydrogen gas during charging that had to be carefully vented to prevent the boat from becoming a floating bomb, and most critically from a tactical perspective, the charging process forced the submarine to remain on the surface for extended periods whether tactical conditions were favorable or not, whether enemy forces were nearby or not, a weakness that radar would exploit with merciless efficiency, turning every charging period into a potential death trap. During these vulnerable charging periods, U-boats followed absolutely predictable patterns born of engineering necessity rather than tactical choice, running at 8 to 12 knots to maximize diesel efficiency and minimize fuel consumption on long patrols, maintaining steady courses to avoid excessive battery drain from constant maneuvering and course changes, posting extra lookouts, scanning the sky and horizon, but relying primarily, almost completely, on their Metox radar detectors to warn them of approaching aircraft long before human eyes or ears could detect the threat. The French-built Metox device swept frequencies from 79 to 300 MHz, covering the 1.5-meter wavelength, ASV Mark II radars that RAF Coastal Command aircraft had carried since 1940. This gave U-boats typically 5 to 10 minutes warning before an aircraft could reach attack position, precious time to crash, dive and escape to the safety of the depths. More than enough time in almost every case to get below periscope depth before the aircraft arrived overhead. The Metox receiver, manufactured by a small electronics company in occupied Paris using French components, had absolutely transformed U-boat survivability when it was introduced in August 1942. Its distinctive Biscay cross antenna, looking like a wooden crucifix, erected prominently on the conning tower, the characteristic crackling and buzzing sounds in the operator's headphones whenever enemy radar pulses struck the antenna, the pitch and frequency increasing as the aircraft drew closer, giving the commander precise warning. and U-boat crews had learned to trust it completely with their lives, diving only when Metox actually warned them of danger, conserving precious battery power, and maintaining mobility on the surface as long as possible. This would have been absolutely impossible if they had to dive for every distant aircraft engine sound, every bird flock, every false alarm. But Metox had given them confidence and operational freedom, except Metox had a fatal limitation that German scientists and engineers hadn't anticipated, hadn't even considered possible. It simply couldn't detect wavelengths below 50 centimeters, leaving U-boats completely and utterly blind to the 10-centimeter emissions of Type 271 radar and the similar ASV Mark III that equipped Allied aircraft. And even worse for German prospects, Nazi scientists had convinced themselves through faulty theoretical calculations that centimetric radar was technically impossible to build, that atmospheric absorption would make such high frequencies useless for detection beyond a few hundred meters, a catastrophic miscalculation that would cost them the entire Battle of the Atlantic and 30,000 young lives. The Italian experience in the Mediterranean provided a preview, a warning of what awaited the U-boats, though neither the German nor Italian navies learned from each other's failures because Naxos cooperation was virtually non. The Regia Marina entered the war in June 1940 with no radar whatsoever, not a single working set in their entire fleet. Their admirals and commanders had dismissed electronic detection as completely unnecessary in the confined waters of the Mediterranean, where visual contact was supposedly always possible, where traditional naval warfare methods had worked for centuries. An assumption that British radar-equipped vessels would shatter repeatedly in devastating night engagements, most catastrophically at the Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941, where 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers were annihilated in a night action they literally never saw coming, never knew was happening until shells were landing on their decks. Admiral Angelo Iachino, commanding the Italian fleet at Metox, would later write with bitter honesty in his memoirs, "We were fighting completely blind against an enemy who could see perfectly in total darkness. His ships unable to detect the approach of British battleships, whose Type 279 air search radar tracked them at 24,000 yards, nearly 14 miles, while Italian optical rangefinders and lookouts, with excellent night vision training, saw absolutely nothing except darkness. The British guns opened fire at point-blank range, achieving complete tactical surprise. And even after this absolute disaster, this crushing defeat, the Italian Navy wouldn't receive its first operational radar sets until spring 1943, far too late to affect the naval balance that had already shifted decisively toward the Allies in the Mediterranean. If you're finding this deep dive into the hidden technology that changed World War II fascinating, please hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today, and what aspect of this story surprises you most. Your engagement helps us continue producing detailed historical content like this. The Japanese Navy, despite beginning serious radar development work as early as 1936, under Professor Yagihito, the brilliant physicist whose Yogi antenna design would ironically become standard equipment on Allied radar systems, suffered from even worse organizational dysfunction than the Italians when it came to radar deployment. The Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army developed completely separate and incompatible radar systems that couldn't communicate with each other, couldn't share technology or research findings, because the rivalry between the two services was so intense and bitter that they literally preferred to lose the war rather than cooperate effectively. And by 1943, when most Allied ships carried multiple sophisticated radar sets for different purposes, Japanese vessels were still relying primarily on optical rangefinders, mechanical fire control computers, and the supposedly superior natural night vision of their carefully selected lookouts, a severe handicap that American radar-directed naval gunfire would exploit absolutely ruthlessly in the brutal night surface battles around Guadalcanal in late 1942 and early 1943. Commander Tomei Chihara of the Japanese destroyer Shiga would describe with shocking honesty the absolute shock and terror of facing American radar-directed weapons at the Battle of Tassafaronga in November 1942. American torpedoes came from nowhere, from directions we weren't even looking. No gun flashes to reveal positions, no searchlights sweeping the water, just sudden massive explosions as our cruisers burst into flames and began sinking. The Americans were firing from positions we couldn't see. hitting targets with accuracy we couldn't explain, guided by equipment we didn't understand and couldn't counter. Though even this devastating demonstration of overwhelming radar superiority didn't convince Japanese naval leadership to dramatically prioritize radar development, their Type 22 surface search sets produced only 2 kilowatts of power compared to the 70 kilowatts of improved British Type 271Q sets, leaving them hopelessly outmatched back in the North Atlantic, which remained the decisive theater of the naval war. The first subtle signs that something fundamental had changed in submarine warfare came gradually through the dark winter months of 1942 into early 1943. U-boat commanders began reporting in their radio transmissions and patrol reports increasingly accurate night attacks by Allied escort vessels, with depth charges falling much closer to their actual positions than pure luck or skilled seamanship could explain, even in weather conditions where visual detection should have been completely impossible. But German naval intelligence officers, analyzing these reports in their Berlin headquarters, attributed this troubling trend to improved Allied tactics and better training rather than revolutionary new technology. A fatal misunderstanding, a complete failure of imagination that prevented any effective countermeasures from being developed during the crucial period, when they might have made a difference. The British, meanwhile, working with focused intensity at their radar research facilities, were systematically and rapidly upgrading their already superior radar capabilities. The Type 271Q, introduced in early 1943, featured a more powerful 70 kilowatt cavity magnetron, providing even greater range and resolution than the original Type 271. Combined with revolutionary plan, position indicator displays that showed operators a god's-eye view of the surrounding ocean. Contacts appeared as bright glowing dots on the circular screen with their range and bearing immediately apparent, allowing escort commanders to coordinate complex multi-ship attacks with unprecedented precision. Lieutenant Commander Donald McIntyre, commanding the famous escort Group B-2 that would sink multiple U-boats, described the complete transformation in his detailed after-action reports. With Type 271Q fully operational and our operators trained to expert level, night surface attacks by U-boats have become absolutely suicidal for the Germans. We can detect them within seconds of surfacing, track them continuously and precisely while they charge their batteries, completely unaware of our presence, and attack with devastating accuracy before they have any idea we're even nearby. The radar operator calls out ranges and bearings while we close for the kill at maximum speed. Hedgehog projectiles fired on radar bearing alone with no need whatsoever for visual contact with the target. Though these detailed reports were very carefully classified at the highest secrecy levels to prevent the Germans from realizing their catastrophic technological disadvantage, from understanding why their losses were mounting so horrifically, the Hedgehog anti-submarine weapon itself represented another brilliant technological leap forward that radar detection made. Devastatingly effective in actual combat, 24 spigot mortar arranged in rows, firing contact-fused projectiles ahead of the attacking vessel in an oval pattern, allowing continuous sonar contact to be maintained throughout the entire attack instead of losing the target completely in the ship's turbulent wake, as happened with traditional depth charges dropped from stern racks, and when combined with accurate radar detection of a surfaced or snorkeling U-boat, when the attacking escort knew exactly where the submarine was located, the kill probability increased dramatically from less than 5% with conventional depth charge attacks to over 30% with coordinated radar-directed Hedgehog attacks. The statistics told a story of technological dominance translating directly into dead submarines and drowned crews, but the real transformation, the development that would prove absolutely decisive in winning the Battle of the Atlantic, came with airborne centimetric radar systems. The ASV Mark III entered operational service with RAF Coastal Command in early 1943, using the same revolutionary 10-centimeter technology as shipborne Type 271, but mounted in patrol aircraft, particularly the very long-range B-24 Liberators that could patrol the dreaded mid-Atlantic air gap, that vast stretch of ocean previously beyond the range of land-based aircraft coverage where U-boats had operated with relative impunity. And these airborne radars could detect a fully surfaced U-boat at 20 nautical miles distance, could pick up even a periscope at 5 miles. all without triggering the Metox receivers that U-boat crews trusted absolutely with their lives. Squadron leader Terence Bullock, an experienced pilot flying B-2 for Liberators, equipped with ASV Mark III, out of bases in Iceland and Northern Ireland, described his first radar-directed attack on a completely unsuspecting U-boat with clinical precision. Radar operator called contact at 18 miles bearing 090 degrees. We approached from down moon to minimize any chance of visual detection, maintaining cruising altitude until the very last moment. The U-boat was clearly charging batteries, running steady on diesel engines, making perhaps 12 knots. Absolutely no indication whatsoever that they knew we were coming. No crash dive, no lookouts, scanning our direction, nothing. We switched on the lee light at 1 mile distance, catching them completely exposed like actors on a stage. Deck gun unmanned, bridge watch, scrambling desperately for the hatch. Our depth charges straddled the boat perfectly as they attempted an emergency crash dive. Oil slicks and debris surfaced moments later. One of 6 U-boats his squadron would destroy in March 1943 alone, and his experience was being repeated by dozens of coastal command crews across the Atlantic. The lee light itself, a brilliant innovation consisting of a 22 million candle power searchlight mounted under the aircraft's wing, turned the final approach into an inescapable death trap for any U-boat caught on the surface at night. The brilliant white beam stabbing down from the darkness like the finger of an angry god, illuminating the submarine with the intensity of midday sun, giving aircraft gunners perfect visibility for devastating strafing runs with 50 caliber machine guns, while depth charges tumbled toward the frantically diving boat. And U-boat survivors, the handful who lived through these attacks, would describe for the rest of their lives the absolute psychological terror of that sudden blinding illumination. The knowledge that they had perhaps 30 seconds to live. Oberleutnant Sir C. Herbert Werner, executive officer on U-230, and one of the few who survived multiple war patrols, recorded the nightmarish experience in his powerful memoir, Iron Coffins. The night exploded into brilliant white light, without any warning whatsoever. No alert from Metox, no engine sound audible over our own diesels. Just sudden blazing illumination from directly overhead, as if God himself was spotlighting us for destruction. Men screaming aircraft, aircraft as we tumbled through the conning tower hatch in pure panic. The boat went into an emergency crash dive as massive explosions shook the entire hull. Depth charges so close that cork insulation rained down from the overhead, and we knew with absolute certainty then that something fundamental had changed in this war, that the night no longer belonged to us, that we were being hunted by an enemy with capabilities we couldn't match or counter. Though Werner's boat survived that particular attack, through a combination of the commander's skill and pure luck, many others weren't so fortunate and went to the bottom with all hands. By March 1943, the combination of shipborne, Type 271 radar and airborne ASV Mark III had created an integrated electronic detection network that left literally no safe space for U-boats to surface and charge their batteries, no refuge from Allied sensors. Every convoy was now surrounded by multiple radar-equipped escorts that could see clearly in absolute darkness and through fog and rain, while long-range patrol aircraft equipped with radar that U-boat warning systems couldn't detect patrolled the transit routes and known hunting grounds with deadly efficiency, turning the predator definitively into prey, reversing the relationship that had existed since submarines were invented. The mathematics of destruction were absolutely relentless and completely unavoidable. A Type WWII U-boat, the standard German submarine that made up 70% of their fleet, needed to surface for 6 to 8 hours every single day to fully charge its massive battery banks. Its submerged speed of only 7.6 knots was completely insufficient to position ahead of convoys for attacks, meaning it absolutely had to run on the surface at higher speed to gain favorable attack positions. But now, every single hour spent on the surface exposed it to radar detection from ranges far beyond visual contact, far beyond the range where lookouts or periscopes could provide any warning, and once detected by this invisible electronic net, the U-boat faced coordinated attacks from multiple escorts vectored to intercept by radio, from aircraft guided precisely by radar, all striking with devastating accuracy before the submarine commander even knew his boat was in mortal danger. It was a mathematical certainty that losses would be catastrophic, that the U-boat force was being systematically destroyed by technology it couldn't detect or counter. The German response, when it finally came far too late to matter, proved completely inadequate to change the strategic balance. The Naxos radar detector, introduced in September 1943 after losses had already become unsustainable, could theoretically detect 10-centimeter emissions from Allied radars, but it suffered from crippling technical problems, including excessive sensitivity that triggered constant false alarms from friendly aircraft, from atmospheric phenomena, even from certain weather conditions, causing exhausted and terrified crews to start ignoring warnings entirely. And by the time Naxos was deployed, the Allies were already well advanced in developing 3-centimeter radar, operating at even higher frequencies that Naxos couldn't detect either, maintaining their crushing technological advantage through continuous innovation rather than resting on initial achievements. The Germans were always at least 2 years behind in the radar race, and the gap was widening rather than closing as Allied research accelerated. Admiral Doenitz, growing increasingly desperate to understand the sudden catastrophic collapse of his once invincible U-boat offensive, personally interrogated survivors from boats that managed to limp home damaged, analyzed thousands of pages of patrol reports looking for patterns, consulted with his technical experts and intelligence officers. He initially concluded, based on flawed analysis and what German scientists told him was possible, that the Allies must somehow be detecting radio frequency emissions from the Metox receivers themselves, that the defensive equipment was betraying U-boat positions. He ordered all boats to immediately shut down their radar detectors in August 1943, a decision made in desperate ignorance that left them even more vulnerable to air attacks because now they had no warning system at all. Though the real problem, Allied centimetric radar that operated on wavelengths German scientists had declared impossible, remained completely unrecognized by German intelligence until captured equipment from a crashed RAF bomber finally revealed the devastating truth. In late 1943, when it was far too late to develop effective countermeasures or change the war's outcome, the psychological impact on U-boat crews was absolutely devastating to morale and combat effectiveness. Young men who had volunteered for submarine service, believing passionately in their tactical and technological superiority, believing they were joining an elite force that dominated the Atlantic, now found themselves completely helpless against an invisible enemy they couldn't see, detect, or fight. Morale collapsed throughout the U-boat force as boat after boat failed to return from patrol, as the drumbeat heroes who had ravaged American coastal shipping during the glorious happy time of 1942 now died in the Bay of Biscay before even reaching their operational areas, caught by radar-equipped aircraft as they tried to transit through the bay on the surface at night. Funkmott Heinz Schaefer, radio operator on U-977, one of the submarines that would survive the war by fleeing to Argentina after Germany's surrender, described the poisonous atmosphere of fear that permeated every aspect of submarine operations. We no longer felt like hunters stalking prey, but like helpless rabbits being hunted by invisible predators. Every single moment spent on the surface was filled with existential dread. Men constantly watching the sky, straining to listen for distant engine sounds over the diesel noise, knowing that death could come without any warning whatsoever from an enemy we couldn't see, hear, or detect with any equipment we possessed. The old hands, the veterans who survived 1940 and 1941, told stories of the happy time when U-boats ruled the Atlantic and merchant ships died by the dozens. But those glorious days were gone forever, replaced by a fear that grew with every patrol, with every boat that failed to return, until men were volunteering for any other duty rather than face another patrol. His boat was indeed one of the very few to survive the entire war, surrendering to Argentine authorities 3 months after Germany's capitulation. In one of the war's stranger epilogues, the Japanese submarine force, observing German failures from across the world and trying to learn from their Axis allies' catastrophic mistakes, made attempts to gather intelligence about Allied radar capabilities. Admiral Miwa Shigeyoshi, commanding the 6th Fleet Submarine Force, sent urgent requests through diplomatic channels for detailed technical information about Allied radar systems and effective countermeasures. But the Germans, deeply humiliated by their technological defeat and unable to fully explain how completely they'd been outmaneuvered, provided only vague and limited details about centimetric radar capabilities. Japanese submarines, therefore, continued operating throughout 1943 and 1944 with radar warning equipment that was generations behind Allied offensive radar technology. The losses in the vast Pacific mounted steadily as American radar technology, derived from the same British cavity magnetron and developed with American industrial efficiency, made their large, relatively slow fleet submarines easy targets for aircraft and destroyers equipped with superior sensors. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Orita, commanding officer of submarine I-177 and one of the handful of Japanese submarine commanders who survived the war, would later write with painful honesty, "We heard rumors and fragmentary intelligence reports about German U-boats being systematically destroyed by mysterious Allied detection equipment, their experienced crews unable to understand or explain how the enemy found them repeatedly in total darkness, and we experienced precisely the same terror in our Pacific operations. American patrol aircraft appeared from seemingly nowhere with no advance warning from our detection equipment, depth charges and bombs falling around us before we could execute an emergency dive to safety. We learned far too late, when our losses were already catastrophic and irreplaceable, that our technology was generations behind our enemy's capabilities. His boat survived the war only through extraordinary luck combined with exceptional seamanship and tactics. The Italian submarine force, what little remained of it, after 3 years of steady losses in the Mediterranean and Atlantic operations, found an ironic salvation in Italy's September 1943 armistice with the Allies. Their boats switched sides, just as German U-boats were being slaughtered in unprecedented numbers in the Atlantic. Though several Italian submarines operating from bases in the Far East, alongside Japanese forces, chose to continue fighting alongside the Axis, their crews would experience the same radar-induced destruction that had already decimated their German colleagues. Tenant di Vascello, Enzo Grossi, commanding the submarine Cagni during operations before Italy's surrender, described the impossible situation of operating without adequate radar technology against enemies who possessed overwhelming sensor superiority. We were sailing essentially blind, while our enemies had perfect electronic vision in all conditions. Their aircraft found us in weather that should have completely hidden us from any detection. Their destroyers attacked from beyond visual range with uncanny accuracy. Every single time we surfaced was a potentially fatal gamble, knowing that technology we didn't possess and couldn't hope to counter was constantly hunting us. His boat survived only by remaining submerged for unprecedented periods that severely limited operational effectiveness, surfacing just long enough to ventilate the hull and recharge batteries before diving again to relative safety. The integration of radar with other intelligence-gathering technologies multiplied its tactical lethality to devastating effect. High-frequency direction finding, universally known by its abbreviation HFDUF, could triangulate U-boat radio transmissions with remarkable precision when multiple stations received the same signal. Ultra-intelligence derived from the breaking of German Enigma codes revealed patrol routes, wolfpack, assembly positions, and operational orders sometimes before U-boat commanders themselves received them, while radar provided the crucial tactical detection capability needed to exploit this strategic intelligence effectively. The combination created a multi-layered detection network that left U-boats with literally nowhere to hide, no way to operate effectively. Commander Peter Gretton, legendary escort commander of Support Group B7, explained the devastating synergy in his post-war analysis. Ultra-intelligence told us approximately where to look for U-boats based on their orders and intentions. HFDUF told us precisely when they transmitted position reports or contact reports, giving us fresh bearings. But radar actually let us see them when we arrived in their vicinity, turning abstract intelligence into concrete kills, into destroyed submarines and saved merchant ships. A U-boat might evade one detection system through luck or skill, but it couldn't evade all three systems working together in perfect coordination. And once we had them painted on radar, once that green spike appeared on the scope, they were finished. His group alone sank 6 U-boats during the critical convoy battles of May 1943, when the Atlantic War reached its climax. The massive convoy battle around Ons-5 in late April and early May 1943 demonstrated beyond any possible doubt radar's absolutely decisive tactical impact on submarine warfare. 40 U-boats, nearly half of Donitz's available operational strength in the Atlantic. concentrated against this single slow convoy in what should have been an overwhelming numerical advantage. Weather conditions heavily favored the attackers with frequent rain squalls, rough seas, heavy cloud cover, and poor visibility that should have made convoy defense nearly impossible. These were perfect conditions for the surface night attacks that had devastated convoys in 1941 and 1942, but the escorts, Type 271 radars tracked absolutely every approach attempt, vectored reinforcements instantly to threaten sectors of the convoy perimeter, coordinated devastating counterattacks that S-2 halves, retreat continuing 6 U-boats, while losing only 13 merchant ships from the convoy, an exchange ratio that made continued U-boat operations mathematically and strategically impossible. That proved the Battle of the Atlantic had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. During this pivotal multi-day battle, the escort vessel HMS Duncan detected U-boat after U-boat attempting to penetrate the convoy screen under cover of darkness and weather. Her Type 271 operator, a young rating who had been trained just months earlier, called out contact after contact with professional precision. Radar contact bearing 270 degrees, range 3,500 yards, target speed 12 knots, probable U-boat charging batteries on the surface. The destroyer immediately raced toward the intercept position at maximum speed, while the submarine remained completely unaware of detection. Its crew confident in the darkness and rain that concealed them from human eyes, but meant nothing to electromagnetic waves. Only when star shells burst overhead and depth charges began bracketing its position did the U-boat commander realize his boat had been detected, forcing an emergency dive that saved the submarine but eliminated any chance of attacking the convoy. Mission killing the boat for that critical night. This scene repeated itself dozens of times during the ONS-5 battle. Radar turning what should have been a turkey shoot into a defensive victory that shook German confidence to its core. The cumulative effect of radar attacks was absolutely catastrophic for the U-boat arm and unsustainable for German naval strategy. Monthly losses mounted in a terrifying progression that told the story more clearly than any intelligence analysis. 10 boats lost in February 1943, a sustainable if painful rate. 15 boats in March, concerning but still manageable given production rates. 20 boats in April, now exceeding new construction and becoming genuinely alarming to Donitz and his staff. And then the absolutely staggering 42 boats destroyed in May, nearly 3 times the previous worst month in the entire war. Losses that meant the U-boat force was being destroyed faster than it could possibly be replaced. Experienced commanders and crews who had survived multiple patrols and accumulated irreplaceable knowledge were dying faster than new boats could be commissioned from German shipyards. The training pipeline, already stretched to breaking point, was completely unable to keep pace with losses. Quality declined precipitously, as inexperienced crews with barely 6 weeks training were rushed into operational service to fill the gaps. Left by dead veterans, corvette-caping Victor Schatzbahn of Donitz's most successful and decorated commanders with over 100,000 tons of Allied shipping sunk to his credit, withdrew from combat operations after barely surviving a radar-directed attack that nearly killed his entire crew. He told his fellow officers in brutally honest terms, "The game has changed completely and forever. We're fighting an enemy who can see perfectly in absolute darkness, while we're essentially blind. Sending more boats out under current conditions is just systematic murder of our crews. We desperately need revolutionary new technology or completely different tactics. But what we're doing right now, the current operational doctrine, is nothing less than suicide." His stark warnings were largely ignored by a high command that couldn't psychologically accept that their hard-won tactical superiority had simply evaporated overnight. That technology had made their experience and skill irrelevant. The German technical response, when it finally materialized after months of denial and debate, proved completely inadequate to change the strategic situation. The revolutionary Type 21 to boot, designed specifically for sustained underwater operations with vastly enlarged battery capacity, streamlined hull optimized for submerged speed, and revolutionary snorkel technology, should have restored German submarine effectiveness, but crippling production delays caused by Allied bombing of factories and critical component shortages meant that only a single Type 21 submarine completed an actual combat patrol. Before the war's end in May 1945, while the desperate stopgap measure of Retrofitting existing Type 7 boats with Dutch diesel snorkels simply created a different vulnerability. Trading one form of radar signature for another, U-boats could now run diesel engines while remaining submerged at periscope depth, but this reduced speed to barely 5 knots, making it completely impossible to maneuver into favorable attack positions ahead of convoys. And the snorkel head itself, the breathing tube extending above the surface, created a distinctive radar signature that skilled operators could detect and track, particularly in calm seas where the small target stood out clearly against the smooth surface. Even this Dutch invention, captured in 1940 when Germany conquered the Netherlands, couldn't solve the fundamental problem that radar technology had created for submarine operations. Oberleutnant Xerxes Albert Schnee, commanding U-511 and a highly experienced submarine officer, described the torture of snorkel operations in his detailed patrol reports. Running submerged on diesel engines was absolute physical torture for the crew. Exhaust gases constantly leaked into the boat, despite all our efforts at sealing, poisoning the air we breathed. Pressure changes that occurred when waves covered the float valve burst eardrums and caused agonizing pain. Speed so pathetically slow we couldn't possibly chase or intercept convoys, and always the persistent fear that enemy radar could see our snorkel head just as easily as they'd previously seen our conning towers when we surfaced. We were trading one detection vulnerability for another while simultaneously sacrificing everything that made U-boats effective commerce, radars, the speed and maneuverability that had been our greatest tactical advantages. His frustration and sense of futility was shared by every U-boat commander, forced to adapt to this new impossible reality where there were no good options, only different ways to die. The technological surprise that radar represented was complete and devastating, precisely because German scientists had dismissed Allied centimetric radar as physically impossible. German research into radar technology had produced their own but these experimental devices failed to achieve any useful power levels, generating only a few watts where practical military applications required kilowatts, not realizing, not even imagining that British researchers at Birmingham University had solved the fundamental magnetron problem with a completely different cavity design that generated 50 kilowatts or more where German equivalents produced nothing useful. This failure of scientific imagination, this inability to conceive that others might solve problems they themselves couldn't, cost thousands of submariners their lives and lost Germany the Battle of the Atlantic. Professor Leo Brandt, director of the German Naval Signals Research Department and one of the men responsible for evaluating Allied radar capabilities, would later admit during Allied interrogation with painful honesty, "We convinced ourselves through theoretical analysis that centimetric radar would be useless for practical military applications. Our careful calculations showed that atmospheric absorption at those frequencies would attenuate signals to nothing beyond a few hundred meters maximum range. We never seriously considered that sheer brute power could overcome absorption effects, that the British were generating power levels we thought fundamentally impossible with existing valve technology. Our theoretical models were mathematically correct, but our basic assumptions about what was technologically achievable were fatally and catastrophically wrong." His scientific miscalculation contributed directly to the U-boat massacre of 1943. The Japanese military suffered from remarkably similar technological blindness combined with institutional problems that made effective response impossible. Their radar development program was severely hampered by intense inter-service rivalry between the Imperial Japanese Navy and Imperial Japanese Army that prevented any meaningful sharing of research, technical data, or operational lessons. This resulted in completely incompatible radar systems that couldn't communicate with each other, couldn't share components or production facilities, couldn't benefit from each other's breakthroughs, while both services fundamentally dismissed American radar capabilities until devastating combat experience taught painful lessons. Synchronized, radar-directed naval gunfire destroyed Japanese ship after ship in the savage night battles around Guadalcanal, achieving hit rates that seemed impossible with optical fire control alone. Captain Toshikazu Ome, serving in the Imperial Japanese Navy's operations section and responsible for tactical analysis, described the shocking realization that came far too late to affect the war's outcome. "We believed absolutely that our superior night fighting skills and superb optical equipment gave us decisive advantage in darkness. Our lookouts were carefully selected and trained to see in minimal light conditions. Our oxygen-powered Type 93 torpedoes were invisible during their runs, leaving no telltale wake. But the Americans could see us clearly beyond visual range in absolute darkness. Their radar-directed guns fired with accuracy we simply couldn't match using optical range. Our carefully cultivated tactical superiority became meaningless against technology we didn't possess and couldn't hope to counter. His professional assessment came too late to affect Japan's defeat. The Italian Navy's experience proved equally tragic and highlighted how completely radar changed the naval balance in the Mediterranean. Their handful of Gufo radar sets arriving in spring 1943, just months before Italy's armistice and surrender in September, far too late to reverse 3 years of devastating losses to Royal Navy forces equipped with superior sensors. Admiral Raphael de Corton, serving as Italian Navy Chief of Staff, lamented in his post-war writings, "We entered a technological war armed with 19th century methods and mentality, believing that Mediterranean conditions made radar unnecessary for successful operations, that our excellent optical rangefinders and extensively trained crews could match British electronic technology through skill and experience alone." But the catastrophic defeat at Cape Matapan in March 1941 proved, beyond doubt, we were fighting essentially blind against an enemy with perfect vision in darkness. And by the time we finally accepted this painful reality and began serious radar development, our fleet was already crippled beyond recovery. Only 12 Italian warships received radar installations before the September 1943 surrender ended Italy's participation in the war. The strategic impact of radar's victory extended far beyond mere numbers of boats sunk or tonnages destroyed. The U-boat threat that had nearly starved Britain into submission in 1940 through 1942, that had sunk millions of tons of irreplaceable shipping, was neutralized so thoroughly and completely that Allied convoys crossed the Atlantic virtually unmolested. After June 1943, American Liberty ships, mass-produced in dozens of shipyards using revolutionary assembly line techniques, were now delivering supplies to Britain faster than even peak U-boat performance could sink them, completely reversing the strategic calculus. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not by superior courage or better seamanship, not by more escorts or more depth charges, but by technology the Germans never saw coming, never anticipated, couldn't counter, even when they finally understood what was killing them. Winston Churchill, who had famously declared that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war, would later write in his memoirs with characteristic eloquence, "The cavity, physically no larger than a small electric motor that could fit in a man's hand, proved more valuable to Britain's survival than entire divisions of troops or fleets of destroyers." This single device gave our forces the revolutionary ability to see in complete darkness what German submarines thought was hidden and safe, turning their greatest tactical advantage into their fatal weakness overnight. A single scientific breakthrough worth more in strategic terms than all the gold reserves in the Bank of England. His assessment was fully confirmed by the statistics of victory that followed radar's deployment. The American contribution to radar development, initially limited to adapting and mass-producing British technology under license, soon exceeded the original British achievements in important ways. American engineers developed improved magnetrons generating even higher power levels with better reliability. Their 3-centimeter H2X radar, operating at an even higher frequency than British systems, achieved resolution that could detect submarine periscopes in sea states that completely swamped 10-centimeter returns with clutter. This ensured that Allied technological superiority would continue advancing faster than German countermeasures could possibly adapt, that the technology gap would widen rather than close as the war continued. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, and initially somewhat skeptical of British radar performance claims based on his conservative nature, became an enthusiastic convert after personally witnessing demonstration results. The ability to reliably detect a periscope at night in rough seas initially seemed like pure magic or exaggeration, but Type 271 proved it repeatedly under rigorous test conditions. And once we fully understood the strategic implications for anti-submarine warfare, we pushed production to absolute maximum capacity, equipping every escort vessel and patrol aircraft with centimetric radar as quickly as industry could manufacture the sets. deliberately turning the Atlantic into a U-boat graveyard. His powerful endorsement ensured unlimited resources for radar research and production. The Soviet Navy, receiving Type 271 radar sets through the Lend-Lease program, along with escort vessels and other equipment, achieved similar dramatic results in the confined waters of the Baltic and Arctic. Captain second rank Alexei Lavrov, commanding the destroyer Gremyashi, equipped with British radar, reported in official documents, "British radar gave us eyes in the perpetual polar night, detecting German U-boats attempting to attack our convoys running supplies to The fascist submarines learned that Arctic darkness no longer protected them from detection. Our depth charges found targets that optical lookouts could never have seen in those conditions." Though Soviet domestic radar development remained primitive and largely ineffective throughout the war, dependent almost entirely on Allied equipment and technical assistance, the psychological warfare aspect of radar's impact proved equally devastating to German morale as the physical destruction of submarines. U-boat crews throughout the force developed what military psychiatrists later termed radar neurosis, a form of combat stress disorder, the constant overwhelming fear of invisible detection, of death coming without any warning whatsoever, creating stress casualties even among boats that never actually encountered radar-directed attacks. Men suffered mental breakdowns from the unbearable strain of knowing death could come at any moment without warning. Morale collapsed throughout the entire U-boat arm as boat after boat failed to return from patrol, as the legendary drumbeat heroes who had ravaged American coastal shipping during the glorious happy time of 1942 now died in the Bay of Biscay before even reaching operational areas, caught by radar-equipped aircraft during what should have been safe nighttime transit. Corvetton caping Reinhard Lament Willenbrock, commanding the famous U-96 that would later be dramatized in the film Das Boot, observed the psychological deterioration with growing alarm. Crews that had previously been eager for combat, confident in their superiority, now openly dreaded leaving port, especially new crew members who heard terrifying stories from survivors, tales of boats caught on the surface with absolutely no warning, entire crews lost in minutes, comrades drowning in darkness, and you could see the fear in their eyes during battery charging periods. Everyone constantly listening for aircraft engines, obsessively watching for searchlights, knowing that radar made us visible when we couldn't see anything approaching. The hunters had become the hunted, prey rather than predators. His own boat survived through a combination of exceptional skill and remarkable luck. The technological race continued at full intensity even after radar's decisive impact became completely clear to German leadership. German engineers developed the Hohenwald surface search radar for U-boats, capable of detecting aircraft at 10 to 20 kilometers and surface vessels at 7 kilometers under good conditions, but it operated at wavelengths that Allied radar detectors could easily identify, creating an impossible dilemma where using radar to detect approaching enemies simultaneously revealed the U-boat's position to those same enemies, completely negating any tactical advantage. Fregattankapitän Gunther Hessler, Donitz's son-in-law and chief of staff at U-boat command headquarters, analyzed this technological trap with brutal honesty in classified reports. Every single countermeasure we developed arrived far too late and inevitably created dangerous new vulnerabilities. Naxos could detect 10-centimeter radar but not 3-centimeter. Our own Hohenwald radar revealed our positions to enemy direction finders. Snorkels reduced speed below any tactical usefulness. The revolutionary electroboot might have restored our operational advantage, but production came years too late to matter. We were always at minimum one step behind in a technological race where second place meant death for our crews. His pessimistic assessment reflected the High Command's growing recognition of complete and irreversible defeat. Thank you so much for watching this deep investigation into the secret technology that changed World War II. If you enjoyed this detailed historical analysis, please subscribe to the channel and check out the other videos on your screen now for more fascinating untold stories from history.